I'm Afshin Rattansi, and you're watching a Going Underground special. In the week, the British authorities, after nearly 7 years of arbitrary detention, captured the founder of WikiLeaks. Coming up on the show.
When one publication publishes a dynamite story, other publications don't have a story, and so they try and undermine the story in some way. They have to write something, so they'll often do that. And then, unfortunately, a lot of those people are too close to the very powers that they should be trying to hold to account. If we go back and look at what the US military, Robert Gates and General McMullen, said about our publications of creating hypotheticals that maybe they would cause harm, our publications documented their involvement at a case-by-case level in the deaths of more than 20,000 people in Afghanistan and more than 108,000 people in Iraq. Those are the stakes that we were talking about. Not only the dissolution of two societies, but the deaths of over 100,000 people. And so when you want to distract from this, you just make the same accusation to the person that is making accusation against you. It's sort of kindergarten rhetoric.
The founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, there speaking to Going Underground from the Ecuadorian embassy. Before we go to Doughty Street Chambers in London to speak to Julian's lawyer, Jeffrey Robertson, QC, about the legal and human rights implications of the case, I'm joined now from Sydney in Australia by legendary journalist and filmmaker John Pilger. John, welcome to Going Underground. You've said the arrest of Julian Assange by British authorities is a warning to all journalists. Explain.
It's a warning from history. It's a stark warning. Anybody watching that shocking image of Julian being forced out of the embassy by half a dozen police and pushed into a van will know that if that can happen to somebody for using journalism to let us know the truth, that can happen to anybody. And if Julian as he's in prison now, but if he's on the way to an American prison, well, the principle is unaltered. On the way to an American prison could be a host of other editors if they push their luck. Catherine Viner of The Guardian, the editor of the New York Times, and I don't say that lightly, the lead lawyer of the New York Times has said that if Julian and WikiLeaks can be prosecuted, so can the editors of those newspapers that carried their work. This is an assault on journalism. But you know, more than that, it's an assault on citizenship, because it can happen to anybody right across the world. It is saying that international law doesn't apply. Julian was an accredited beneficiary of the whole notion of asylum. The United Nations Working Party on arbitrary detention made that absolutely clear, and it was clear in covenants to which Britain is a signatory. Now, if that can be torn up, if a regime as mired in murk and corruption as the Lenin-Moreno regime in Ecuador is today, can call in the police in any country to arrest asylum seekers, then think of all the historical examples. We don't have to think about them so much. I reported from the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War in the 1970s, and I watched the KGB and their associates do something similar to dissidents, intimidate them, march them out of their flats, intimidate their families. That was for political reasons. What has happened to Julian has happened on a political whim. The idea that it's about bail infringement is ridiculous. We both know that. It's about getting him across to a supermax in the United States. It opens up a whole chapter of really diminishing the very principles that came out of the Second World War upon which the Universal Declaration is based. It shows how fragile they are. do these lesser political beings in London, in this government, really understand that? Do they understand what they're setting in train? I don't think so.
You say it's a warning to journalists, journalists all around the world, let alone here in Britain, Sky News, Channel 4 News, of course, the CNN in the United States seem much more keen to emphasize that this is nothing about these big values you're talking about. It's more about messiness in the embassy, now, of course, under the control of Lenin Moreno in Quito, and rape accusations.
Of course they do, because journalism in recent years has changed, not radically. It was always, the so-called mainstream was always an extension of the state, of the state's ideology. Our freedom of debate has diminished, that how the powerful are no longer challenged. They're challenged on a trivial level, but how they're not challenged about the greatest humanitarian disaster in the world today, and that is in Yemen, for which the British government is largely responsible, and where Britons are helping to direct this atrocity, helping with bomb aiming for Saudi aircraft and logistics and strategies and so on. When has this been made a burning issue of debate? We've entered a whole world of the abandonment of basic democracy, which is based on dissent, on challenging, on holding power to account, on revelation, on the embarrassment of power. Not trivial embarrassment, the embarrassment of the odd celebrity, but real embarrassment. And WikiLeaks provided that service, that public service of journalism, and it did it without fear or favor. You know, they published something like 800,000 documents on Russia, documents from the Kremlin, documents that were used in court cases in Russia. They've published the same about China, but the United States and Britain, particularly the United States, has aroused the ire, because what we're in the midst of at the moment is the world's great superpower struggling to maintain its dominance, its information dominance, its technological dominance, its cultural dominance. And WikiLeaks has presented an extraordinary hurdle to this. Julian Assange then has become enemy number one, but he should be, and I don't say this lightly, he should be hero number one. Hero number one, because if we lose the Assanges, and there aren't many of them, if a handful maybe, there's certainly no one like him. If we lose the WikiLeaks, then we lose a whole strata of freedom. We stop questioning.
You said he is a hero. The Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, here said he is no hero. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, started in the House of Commons by saying the House should welcome his arrest. Alan Duncan, the Foreign Minister, said it's total rubbish to raise the UN ruling on arbitrary detention. And the judge, because quite apart from the media that we talk about quite often, the judge, District Court Judge here, Michael Snow in Westminster Magistrates Court, characterized Assange as having the behavior of a narcissist who can't get beyond his own selfish interest.
Well, that's just abuse. That's not a judge. That's an abuser. Another judge would recognize that as an abuser. The rest, frankly, you name Jeremy Hunt, the man responsible for so much destruction of the National Health Service when he was Secretary of State for Health. I mean, frankly, I don't think these are credible people. I think in the world of politics, we're in a very diminished state. I'm trying to be polite about this, but I mean, commenting on what Hunt says or the rest of them, it used to be like commenting on what Boris Johnson says. There's the problem. There's another problem, of course. Where is the opposition Diane Abbott made a spirited effort to describe Julian Assange's dilemmas and his health and so on. But what did the leader, what did Jeremy Corbyn say? He said that the government should oppose his extradition. I mean, frankly, it's best that Jeremy Corbyn doesn't say anything rather than tepid remarks like that. If there was an opposition leader who could stand up to the Mays, the Hunts, and the rest, then perhaps we'd have some sense of real truth in debate. To simply say the government should oppose the extradition is not enough. It should be spelt out in Parliament what this extradition might mean. That it threatens Julian's life, that he could end up spending the rest of his life in the kind of conditions that the UN reporter on torture has already described. He's already said that that's what he faces. That's what we need to hear from the political opposition in Britain.
Okay, well, let's go to one of the most important WikiLeaks revelations, according to Julian Assange. You've obviously covered so many decades of war by great powers. He said the US Special Forces Unconventional Warfare Manual about sabotage, subversion, intelligence, overthrowing foreign governments, specifically naming the IMF and the World Bank and OECD as players in these strategies for unconventional warfare. He said that was one of the most important leaks. Was it to you?
Yes, I think it was one of the most important leaks because it demonstrates the very nature of how the United States fights its colonial wars. There are so many leaks that are related to telling us about the true nature of war. Of course, what really got Julian into trouble, and Chelsea Manning, of course, was the video of collateral murder. And that expressed most graphically what I would describe as the whole homicidal nature of American colonial wars, and especially in Iraq, the 360-degree view of just kill them all. And anybody watching that video really has to read very little else of the WikiLeaks revelations about the nature of American wars, because there it is. There is a kind of consensual belief, I'm trying to think of a polite term for brainwashing, frankly, that we don't do these kind of things. We are perpetually benign on our side, and the Americans are part of that. These things simply do not happen. They only happen on their side. They're done by totalitarian states. They're done by rogue states, when in fact, clearly the biggest rogue state of all is the United States, the one that ignores international law, that has threatened the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, has told her that she can't have a visa to visit the United Nations in New York.
John Pilger, I'll stop you there. More from John Pilger after this break. And we go to world-famous Doughty Street Chambers to speak to its founder, Julian Assange's lawyer, Jeffrey Robertson, QC. That's all coming up after this break. Welcome back. I'm still here with legendary journalist and filmmaker John Pilger. As of the timing of this interview, there's been no real solidarity shown by Bernie Sanders, unlike fellow presidential candidate for the Democrats, Tulsi Gabbard. But here, we've been told, and in the United States, Clinton email releases by WikiLeaks were embarrassing, rather than any mention, say, of money for the Clinton Foundation from nations associated with Islamist terrorism. What's the difference here? Embarrassing versus corruption, and corruption against, arguably, the interests of the United States?
I think that shows the almost, what is it? It's a kind of primal need to protect these people. The Clinton emails, the Podesta emails, what they showed was that Hillary Clinton, was a bedfellow of those who backed jihadism in the Middle East. That she knew that the backers of jihadism in the Middle East, principally Saudi Arabia, she knew what they were doing. So she knew about the source of jihadism when IS was at its height. And she was then Secretary of State. And she organized the biggest arms deal in history in selling arms, American arms, to Saudi Arabia. But it made her a de facto ally of jihadism in the Middle East. What that has to do with embarrassment, I don't know. If anyone's embarrassing, I would have thought she is, or ought to be, and her superiors and her underlings in Washington. It's a ridiculous way of characterizing it.
Let's go to Vault 7, the largest CIA leak in history via WikiLeaks. Important about the revelations of malware in all our mobile phones and making hacks appear as if they're from China and Russia.
Edward Snowden has explained all this. Your phone can spy on us. It really infuriated the CIA, and that's very understandable because it told us what they're up to. It told us the intensity and sophistication of their surveillance. And so much of this, and I mentioned earlier about almost everything has to do with America trying to reclaim its dominance, particularly in relation to China. The whole campaign against Huawei is over 5G technology. And Huawei has claimed, with some justification, that their devices are the only ones without a backdoor that the NSA cannot enter. In other words, you can have a device from Huawei that isn't contaminated by the NSA or the other agencies in the United States. And you can also have 5G. The Chinese development in technology is soaring ahead. That has so much to do with all of this.
What about the fact that Assange explicitly emphasized one cable from Ambassador William Roebuck to destabilize Syria, that big news story that's all but disappeared from all our front pages in recent weeks, that cable supposedly about instigating a war as far back as 2006?
The media, as I've said, is an extension of governments and their vested interests. And the British government, the US government, set out to overthrow the government in Syria. They've failed so far. They've failed. For those who wanted to know the truth, there it was in a WikiLeaks cable, the destabilization of Syria. But look, you can go back. I've seen MI6 cables back in the 50s that have been declassified that talk about the same thing, about how they can destabilize Syria. It was then Assad's father. Syria was an important piece in the whole Middle East chess game for Western powers, Western oil powers. It's been going on for a very long time.
John Pilger, thank you.